Well, we have someone come to continue a continuing story this morning, part 2. Liz told me there's a part 3 coming as she raced out the door to head towards the youth thing out on the north side. Let's start with a word of prayer. Father, thank you for Sabbath mornings with the sun shining and your church filling up. We pray now that we can have a good time together. We can learn more about mission and be encouraged to be missionaries in our own little field. I pray in your name. Amen. Well, Peter has been here. When was the last time you came here? A month or two ago? February? And I hope it does. Musicians will be most upset for us changing it.
I'll change it.
Right, now, Liz did send me a screenshot. The miracles that make a missionary.
Yes.
So you're continuing on from that?
I'm continuing the story, yes.
Okay. So, well, I might leave you to it.
All
and
right, thank you.
Maybe you can give us a teaser for part 3 to come when you're finished.
I'll do that. Good morning, everybody. So yes, it was a month or so ago that I was here, and if I can remember which button I need to push. So I want to start with a text this morning. And the reason I've chosen this picture is that this text talks about the mightiness of God. And I don't think you can understand the mightiness of God until you see big mountains, which is where Rajendra, who we've been talking about, lives in Nepal. So in Deuteronomy 10:21, and just before Deuteronomy 10:21, in Deuteronomy 20, God is saying to Moses, "Fear the Lord your God and serve him." And then he says, "He is the one you praise. He is your God who performed for you the great and awesome wonders, and who you saw with your own eyes." And it's talking particularly about the children of Israel coming out of Egypt, going through the Red Sea, and God gives them not only the commandments, but he also gives them messages of encouragement and love. And that's the context that I want to set before you this morning as we continue our story. So last time I introduced to you Rajendra, and you'll remember that this was an orphan boy who lived in Nepal. He was sent to India to school. It was a pretty tough time for him. And one of the things that over the 12 years or so that he was at school was that he had this photo of Fiona and I when we were married, and that was his family, and he kept that under his pillow, and that's what connected him to family and to life. And after I spoke last time, there were a couple of people that came up and said to me, "I've sponsored children with Asian Aid, or I've sponsored children with other organisations." And every time someone tells me that, I'm really grateful that it's not just me that has this passion to give an opportunity to a child who is born into circumstances that is completely out of their control, but that we can give them that opportunity of education, and certainly, and in sometimes they even get to meet Jesus and to follow him. But today, I want to share 3 brief stories that have basically turned someone that was like a pen pal in a way into someone who we have built a relationship that is much more meaningful, and certainly a relationship that is very challenging at times. So it was in 1990. My wife and I were in the process of building our house. And so we had moved out of our rental property and were living with Fiona's parents for a few months, or it was nearly a year, I think, while we were building our house. And where the property was, just out of Toowoomba, they didn't have a regular mail service. To get your mail, you had to go to the post box or post office, which was just a little shop in a small village called Westbrook, just out of Toowoomba. And one day we were notified that there was a letter that we had to pick up. And you know how you get the little card that says you've got a package or you've got a letter, and usually it means that you've got to pay something. And I don't remember, it might have cost us $1 or something like that. But this envelope, this letter, and I still have it today, it is very flimsy, arrived in the mail. Now, how it arrived at us is amazing in so many different ways. So first of all, we were surprised because we saw Rajendra's name on it and we wondered how on earth he got his address, because when we sent letters to Rajendra, we sent them to Asian Aid. Asian Aid takes the address off. They just send their letter so that you don't get begging letters and things like that. So to get a letter addressed to us, and it's old Australia, was a really interesting address, was pretty phenomenal. And I've talked to Rajendra a few times about this letter, and it becomes even more phenomenal is that, one, he has no idea where he got our address from, absolutely no recollection of it all. He has no recollection of even where he managed to find an envelope to send this particular letter. And then the fact that this very flimsy letter, which, I don't know, if you've ever been to a mail centre, you just wonder how it didn't get lost, destroyed, or something like that. But it was obviously something that God felt was important to get to us at that particular time. You know, God knows when the smallest a little bit of faith can make a huge change in the world. And Rajendra put his little tiny bit of faith, because he was only about 8 or 9 at this point in time, into writing this letter, hoping that it was going to make a difference. So this is the letter. It's still inside. I'm not going to take it out. It's a bit fiddly, but so in this letter, what he spelled out to us, that he was heartbroken because he had failed a maths exam. And the reason he'd failed his maths exam, and it was so important for him as a little boy that he get his education, he knew that people were paying for his education, so to fail was kind of not something that you wanted to do. But the reason he'd failed, and the reason that he was so passionate about this, is because he had not received his textbooks. You may remember I was telling you last week that the Asian Aid students at the school that he were at sometimes did not get treated that well. And some of the times they would withhold the money, they would use it for other things other than to pay for the boys that Asian Aid sponsored. So he sent this letter, and the fact that this was such a small miracle just showed, though, that this little boy was quite resourceful. And as a result of this letter, we contacted Asian Aid, and Asian Aid actually did some investigation into their Indian operations and found out that this was happening not only for Rajendra, but for multiple children, that the schools were withholding funds from the Asian Aid children. And it actually meant that they changed some of their operating things to better look after these children. So that was the first story. And that was pretty amazing to us at the time, and like everything that happens that is sensational, I guess, we kind of enjoy the moment and then move on and sort of kind of put it to the back of our minds. Didn't forget about it, but put it to the back of our minds. The next thing that is pretty sensational from my point of view, and what started to really grow Rajendra to the person that he is today is that it was about 10 years later. He was living in Kathmandu. He had just finished his high school. He was doing some study at Spicer Memorial College in ministry. And he was called to be a missionary in a place called Sikkim. Being a missionary can be a pretty challenging thing to do at the best of times. But for him, he was called at short notice. He basically left Kathmandu to go to Sikkim with just the clothes he was wearing and a few things he could put in a bag. That was all he was able to take. And he arrived in Sikkim, it's now been annexed by India, but it's a neighbour of Nepal. And it's not like our country. It is a Buddhist Hindu country. And Christians are not welcome. In fact, Christians are at times treated particularly badly. It would be one of the countries where Christians are persecuted, if you want to look that up. So Rajendra was in this country. He arrived with next to nothing. Missionaries in developing countries are not the typical missionary that we have here. They struggle to survive. They may get paid monthly if they're lucky, but a lot of the time the money will get stolen before it gets to them. So sometimes their wages can take 2 or 3 months. And so they have to find a way to survive in that time. At this particular time when this story happened, Rajendra actually had an assistant that was helping him out. He was a local boy. He was a Hindu, didn't have any belief in God, but he was his assistant. And at the time that this story happened, they just had no food for 3 days. And this assistant boy just was not happy. He was giving Rajendra a hard time, and Rajendra said to him, well, we're going to pray. So he made him kneel down against his will, but he said, you've got to kneel down. And they prayed, and they asked for God to send food. Rajendra tells me that his favourite food, and he didn't specifically ask for it at the time, but his favourite food is roti, or a flatbread, like a naan, and pickle. The Nepali pickles, it's an acquired taste, I have to say. It is strong. But that was his favourite food. So, hungry as they were, he said that they could actually hear each other's tummies rumbling. They were so hungry. So they went to bed. And the next morning, quite early on in the morning, there was a knock on the door. And at the door, there was an old lady. And Rajendra said to her, because Nepalis are very respectful, it's a very family-oriented culture, Grandma, how can I help you? And the old lady replied to him, you have asked me for food and I have brought it for you. And she handed over this particular pot. When we were there last time, one time he was telling me the story, and I made sure I took a photo because this is the exact pot that she handed over to him. And Rajendra thought, well, I haven't actually asked anyone for food. I just prayed for it, and he's going, that's quite amazing that someone actually figured out that I needed food. And inside the pot were rotis and some pickle, his favourite. Even though he didn't ask for it, that's what was in the pot. So Rajendra thanked her, and she went. And a couple of days later, he wanted to return the pot, so he went looking for the old lady. And so he asked the lady, or he asked the local people if they had seen or where this old lady lived. And no one in the area even knew of any sort of type of person that he could describe. And it was at that point that Rajendra realised that the food wasn't from an old lady, the food had come from an angel. And even God believes in magic. He gave it to him with a pot with magic written on the side. But the food that sustained him and his helper for a short time started to sustain him in his experience and confidence with God, and allowed him to continue to work through some of the toughest experiences in his life. And it was about a year or two later after this, and at this stage, Rajendra was newly married, and this is his wife Sarah, and this is a picture with them in Pokhara, that the last miracle that I'm going to talk to you about today happened. So after his 2 or just short of 2 years in Sikkim, he was newly married. They weren't really sure what their direction was. He was a fledgling pastor, and Sarah was a political analyst, or a political activist, I should say. Quite a unique combination of people. But they were called to go back to their home country of Nepal, and particularly they were asked to go and start a church in a new area, a place that neither of them had been to, a place called Pokhara in the central part of Nepal. And Rajendra and Sarah packed their bags. They didn't have many of them, and off they went. And they would have been in a bus similar to this all day, probably for about somewhere between 12 and 14 hours. Their bags would have been on the roof, probably along with some goats and some other people and some chickens and whatever else they can fit in or on top of the bus. And as Rajendra tells the story, they arrived at the Pokhara bus park quite late at night. It was dark. And Rajendra said to Sarah, I want you to stay in the bus and you hold my briefcase, and I'm going to go and get the bags. So he had to go outside and climb up on the roof and try and retrieve the bags and get them ready. And a short time later, while to Sarah's mind, long enough for Rajendra to get the bags, someone said to her, pass the briefcase out the window to me, and it happened to be a thief. And in the briefcase was all their papers, all their money, all their contacts to start their new church in Pokhara. So this young couple were left on the side of the road at the bus park with just a few dollars in our language, but a few rupees in their pocket and nothing else. And I'm going to leave the story there because what happens after that is truly amazing. But we all think of missionaries as people that end up in our mission story, as people that God works with them and things go well and great things happen. And this story certainly is going to end up like that. But along the way, they have to put up with some pretty severe hardships. Rajendra, he has put up with hardship the whole way through his life. As a child, it was tough. Losing your parents, having to get sent to a foreign country for school, being treated poorly, and then to go through your first mission stint and being sent to one of the toughest places where you didn't know if people were going to come and cut your head off any day of the week. And then just when he thinks he's starting to get his life together and he and his wife want to go and work for God, they lose everything again. And it just shows the power of God in our life when we let ourselves be guided by God, to let God take whatever we have, and if that means maybe losing things along the way, but God's got it all in control. And in, I think, April 12 is when I'm coming back. The story is going to ramp up, and there's been a South Queensland connection all the way through this, but I'm going to tell you about some kids that become involved in this story. So thank you for your time again this morning.
Thank you, Peter. I'm sure you'll all be waiting with bated breath for April 12 to come along and hear the rest of the story. Okay, we call on